If we're all ready to get settled, I would like to introduce Christi-Taylor Jones, the author that will be presenting her book today, Touched by Suicide. Christi is one of our very own analysts, and she's a frequent contributor to our quarterly journal, Psych Perspectives. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to her. Christi.
Talking right into it. No holder or anything. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. And we're actually starting on time, which is unusual for a Jungian talk. But I'm sure there'll be scragglers coming in. Before I start, I'd like to ask a personal question of all of you, and you can show by raising your hand. Actually, 3 questions. How many of you have ever thought about suicide or known somebody who has? How many of you have attempted suicide or know somebody who has? And lastly, how many of you have known someone who died by suicide? Okay. Well, that's more than most people would probably raise their hand to, but in fact, as you may or may not know, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in this country. And worldwide, 800,000 people commit suicide each year, which has increased 60% in the last 45 years. Also, for everyone who dies by suicide, it's estimated that 280 people have contemplated it or are contemplating it. Hello? So my own experience of suicide began with the death of a close friend, followed by a suicidal gesture by my mother, the suicide of my father-in-law, a suicidal moment by my ex-husband, who bought a gun and put it to his head after serving in Vietnam. All of these experiences preceded my own attempt at age 30. I subsequently experienced the suicide or attempted suicide of clients and others before my brother's suicide 10 years ago. And it was that experience that prompted me to finally write my book. Today, though, I'm going to read you a story from the book. And by the way, how many of you have already read the book? Okay, not everybody, because it will be redundant for you, but I am going to be reading one of the stories of a client of mine today. I'm going to call him Charlie. And afterward, after I finish reading this, we'll take a break and then come back and we can talk about that case and any thoughts that you have about it, and also any other questions that you have just about the subject in general. As you listen to the story, here are some things you might consider. What was the motive that prompted his suicide? As a clinician or a non-clinician, if you aren't one, what do you think were some of the red flags? What did and did not seem to help in his treatment? What more could have been done? And what questions remain? In what way does his suicide indicate a longing for rebirth? I also, I want to say that I came to realize that in writing this book, that suicide in many people represents an unconscious drive toward transformation or rebirth. As Jung says, every transformation demands as its precondition the ending of the world, by which he means the collapse of an old philosophy. And if you're reading the book or planning to read the book, you'll be reading about how the underlying purpose of suicide in many cases is symbolic and needs to be understood in symbolic psychological terms. If not, it may end up in a literal suicide. In many cases, a suicidal person mistakenly believes that rebirth can only be obtained through literal death rather than through symbolic death. We may ask what it is in the person's current life that needs to die or be transformed. If that transformation cannot be achieved psychologically, it may need to be acted out literally. I also came to understand that suicide is archetypal. It has existed since the beginning of time, and the attitudes towards it have been very different than they are today. The potential exists in all of us and may be acted out in different ways for different reasons, and has been viewed by the collective in different ways since the beginning of time. Today, it's pathologized. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is to depathologize it. For that reason, people don't talk about it. So I'm going to read, I'm going to try to read and hold this microphone. And this is the story of Charlie. Charlie told me he had called several therapists before me. It was my voice, he said, that prompted him to make the appointment. My voice had a comforting quality. In our first session, I asked him what he hoped to gain from our work together. To feel more at peace with myself, he told me. He said that his grandmother had died recently. She was the only person who ever loved him. His mother had passed away 3 months before he first saw me, but he hated her. Also, his girlfriend had left him after a several-year relationship, and his dog had died. He described a lifetime of abandonments, one after another. His father had left when he was a year old, and his mother had given him over to his grandmother when he was 5. He felt cut off from his sisters, who had remained with Mom. And he had a brother-in-law who he both hated and feared. Charlie said that he carried a loaded gun to protect himself, just in case. Charlie was able to carry a gun because he worked as a security guard after failing the test to become a police officer, his dream career. He'd been referred to special education for learning disabilities as a child and had no college education. He'd been teased a lot in school and had few friends, although he did have one best friend. He said that it was hard for him to get close to anyone. One friend that he liked had committed suicide. All of these factors about Charlie's life raised red flags of concern for me. Charlie described his life as one continuous thread of disappointments and loss. His mother was married at least twice before giving birth to him, and afterward had many lovers. According to Charlie, his mother never wanted him and never liked him. In fact, she wished he'd never been born. Although Charlie told me this, I drew this conclusion myself from the shaming comments his mother made to him. She actually didn't like men, as it turned out, even though she kept marrying them. She preferred her daughters. Charlie could do nothing right, according to his mother. His grandmother had been his only support, but in time I realized that she too had lacked the necessary qualities to adequately mother Charlie. His grandmother was controlling and feared being left alone if one of Charlie's relationships actually worked out. Charlie was in his 40s, had never been married, and had no children. He was more or less a loner. During our work together, I suggested to Charlie that he sign up with the Big Brothers program or another organization that would enable him to mentor someone. I felt that there was something of a failed hero in him, which manifested in his desire to be a cop and protect people from the bad guys. It also led to his subsequent career in security. He seemed to like kids, at least in the abstract. I thought that mentoring would help build Charlie's self-esteem and give his life more meaning. To mentor a young boy, since he might never have a son of his own, he never followed through. Charlie drank heavily before entering therapy. He came from a long line of alcoholics, but he somehow managed to stop. I saw this as a strength. Charlie admitted that he thought about suicide occasionally. However, he wasn't suicidal at the time. He was instead filled with rage, a condition that continued throughout our time together. Charlie projected his anger onto others, which gave rise to almost paranoid fantasies about people doing violence to him or to others. He knew how to play the shame and blame game. Charlie's fantasies about killing bad guys as a cop underscored his desire to be a hero. He was always wanting to save someone, a person, an animal, from an evil other. I wondered if there was a way to redirect these energies toward a more constructive purpose. Charlie's emotions manifested in the extreme, both love and loyalty, as well as hate and vengefulness. He either felt deeply about things or was numb to them. One thing Charlie was numb to was any positive feeling about his mother. On the other hand, he claimed to love his grandmother dearly, in whom he saw no flaws, despite the fact that she seemed controlling. He was unable to hold the tension of the opposites in any form for the purpose of integrating them. He often used the word kill when talking about his anger and what he would like to do to someone who was evil. Ironically, I thought deep down that Charlie believed that he himself was evil. This potential realization must have been so overpowering that Charlie had to project much of the evilness outside of himself. He said that he wasn't afraid of death, although he did not believe in a benevolent God. So I wondered what he thought he'd encounter in the next life. Would it be more of the same or the sweet comfort of nothingness? He said that he didn't think about it. We talked a lot about Charlie's angry feelings and how to manage them. We discussed black and white thinking and how to avoid it. We talked about relationships with women and how to find his softer self, how to get his needs met in constructive ways, and how to reframe his catastrophic thoughts and be good to himself. I identified ways in which I thought that he was scapegoated in his family and how it seemed that many of the family's shadow aspects got projected onto him. I suggested that he had internalized all this negativity and shame. I told him that I wanted us to rewrite his story based on an understanding of his past with a belief in a different story going forward. Christmas was approaching. Charlie had no plans for the holidays, but he gave me a $100 gift certificate to a restaurant he liked. I explained to him that I could not accept the gift and asked instead for him to express what I meant to him. What was the message in the money? I had clearly constellated the savior archetype for him. What the money represented was his gratitude for all of my help. I embodied everything good and kind in his world. I knew that it was his first Christmas without his grandmother and suggested that he find someone with whom to spend the holidays. I told him how touched I was by his generosity, something I hoped that he would show to more people in his personal life. Money is often symbolic of emotional and psychological resources, something of which Charlie was in great need. Instead of accessing those resources within himself, he sought to give them away. Maybe he felt that I was his best resource for healing, or he secretly and metaphorically wished that he were going to the restaurant with me, that he could make union with me in a way that was nourishing to him. These interpretations didn't occur to me until later. I just knew that Charlie was trying to do something generous and kind, and I wondered if he felt rejected by my not accepting his gift. That New Year's, Charlie called a suicide hotline. He did not tell me so until the following week. He said he didn't feel he had any purpose in life. Soon afterward, I encouraged Charlie to turn over his guns to his best friend, whom I had also asked to keep watch on Charlie for the next couple weeks. His friend agreed, and Charlie didn't fight my request. I asked Charlie to call me each day to check in, at which time I would determine whether he needed to come in for a session before our regular appointment. I also consulted Charlie's psychiatrist about the medications that he was taking and whether or not they were working. I informed the psychiatrist that Charlie seemed barely able to hold his life together. Charlie was depressed over work, his grandmother, his sister, his ex-girlfriend. He was vomiting from stress and needed to be tested for an ulcer. The doctor completely agreed with me. Charlie journaled as best he could. In fact, he did all the homework assignments that I gave him, like a good little student. He read the books on grief that I gave him. He thought about dating again and even applying to community college. Charlie told me about a dream that he had, which was about having sex with his niece, with whom he had a positive relationship. I interpret this to mean that he was wanting a more positive union with the feminine, with a more feeling side of himself. I saw his niece as a positive anima figure. Charlie later dreamed about running out of ammo, which seemed to represent his not being able to protect himself, feeling vulnerable to hurt. Ammunition seemed a violent way of protecting himself, though, and we discussed whether he might find other ways to protect himself. Running out of ammo might also have meant that he was running out of fight, resigning, giving up. I was glad that I had taken the initiative previously to have Charlie's guns removed from his possession. Two events happened in the ensuing months that caused Charlie much distress. Charlie learned that his ex-girlfriend had gotten married. He also heard rumors about the company he worked for that suggested to him that he might lose his job. He said that the company was in danger of being sold. Meanwhile, he was experiencing memory problems, which the doctor told him could be the result of his antidepressants. The doctor was going to test Charlie for possible dementia. Charlie said that if he was diagnosed with dementia, he'd kill himself. I don't want to end up in a sanatorium, he told me. I assured Charlie that he wouldn't end up in a sanatorium. I saw no indication of dementia. I also told him that maybe I was pushing him too hard and was not sensitive enough to his struggles. Maybe my insensitivity added to his stress. He said, no, I was helping him. The test results showed no sign of dementia. The doctor said that Charlie's memory problems stemmed from stress and depression. Charlie continued taking the antidepressants. He talked about moving to Las Vegas and starting over. The anniversary of Charlie's grandmother's death was soon upon him as well, causing him to spiral downward again. He'd always felt guilty that he hadn't done more to keep her alive. He was also angry at her doctors and nurses for letting her die. After Charlie's grandmother died, he tried to keep his mother from attending her funeral. His mother and grandmother often fought. We talked about forgiveness and what he'd need in order to forgive his mother and himself. Charlie said that his mother slapped him whenever he cried as a child, so he did not cry for her when she died. Charlie had turned all his grief into anger. I told him because anger is a more powerful emotion than sadness. For the first time, he cried during our therapy session, and afterward, he hugged me. This would be the only time that I would see such an outpouring of feeling from Charlie. We continued to work on Charlie's grief. He remained stuck in two stages, bargaining and anger. Eventually, Charlie could sense sadness around his mother's passing, as well as for all the other losses that he'd experienced, which I saw as an encouraging sign. He started seeing his best friend again and contacting other friends too. Charlie's life was on the upswing. As Christmas neared again, Charlie felt better than he had in a while. He said he was tired of making the long drive to see me and that he wanted a referral to someone closer to his home. He said that he was grateful for all my help and that he was feeling much better. We discussed Charlie's decision to discontinue therapy at length. He insisted that the drive from his home to my office was too much of a hardship and that traffic was getting worse. I wondered if I had let Charlie down in some way or if the work was too intense for him. Although we had made progress, he seemed limited in his ability to work in any depth. I finally accepted his reason and right to leave as valid, and that while the work was not finished, he would continue therapy with someone else. I set to work on finding an appropriate referral. At our last session, just before Christmas, Charlie gifted me with a jar of Vermont honey, symbolic of the sweetness and goodness he seemed to project onto me. He apparently held on to the sourness for himself because 2 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, Charlie shot himself with one of the guns that his friend had been holding for him. Apparently, Charlie told his friend, with whom I spoke later, that he was feeling much better now, so the friend had returned the guns. I found out about Charlie's death a couple months after he died. Someone called me who had found my name and number in Charlie's wallet. I was devastated to the core, especially because I felt I had failed to save him, even after managing to save myself years before. I knew I would spend the rest of my professional life contemplating the difference and wondering if I could have done more. Since then, I've become more attuned to the possibility of suicidal feelings in the clients whom I treat. I recognize that each person has their own story about life and death, and that ultimately the individual's psyche and our relationship to it determines our fate. When Charlie terminated his therapy sessions with me, he was already determined to end his life. He never contacted the referrals that I gave him. He immediately asked his friend to return his guns, and like so many people who begin their emergence from depression, Charlie now had the energy to carry out his mission of self-destruction, leaving behind the symbolic honey or sweetness that he couldn't use. Ironically, a year before Charlie's death, also during the Christmas holiday, he had called the suicide hotline. Christmas, as we know, is a symbolic day, a time when the Savior is born, only to be crucified later. Christmas marks the end of one year and the beginning of a new year, thus a time of death and rebirth. The symbolism of honey is also instructive, as Charlie both gave and left behind honey, at least symbolically. At the close of our last session, Charlie had asked me if his situation and our work together would help me in working with other people like him. An odd question. I said, yes, I learn from everyone I treat. Sometimes I get more from them than they get from me. In the case of Charlie, I got both more and less. I did not get the result that I was seeking, but that was never entirely up to me. What I did get was a deeper understanding of my abilities and limitations as a therapist. I also gleaned more insight into the experience of someone dead set on suicide. Charlie's problems, like those of my brother, who I talk about earlier in the book, were chronic. I believe what finally put Charlie over the edge was a series of events and conditions that shattered all hope. The marriage to someone else of the only woman he loved, a woman in his mind had offered him his last chance for relationship. The threat of losing his job and the possibility that he wouldn't be able to get another one. Fears, despite what the doctors said, that he really did have some form of dementia and would lose his mind entirely. And finally, that if any of these events or conditions disabled him, he would be alone, lacking the physical and emotional supports that he needed to survive. This, of course, is all conjecture. What I do know is that acute problems were heaped onto chronic problems, and that Charlie lacked the inner and outer resources to care for himself or to find the meaning in his circumstances. It is my belief that Charlie had reached the end and knew of no other way to start except through death. In this way, his suicide reflected a longing for rebirth.